For 6 years, I thought my mother-in-law hated me. She was actually protecting me from a truth my husband wasn't ready to tell. I want to start with the specific quality of that coldness, because I think if I don't describe it precisely, you won't understand how convincingly I misread it for 6 long years. It wasn't cruelty. Vera never once raised her voice at me, never said an unkind word in front of anyone else, never did anything a stranger could point to and call outright hostility. It was something quieter and, in its own way, harder to defend against. A careful, deliberate distance, maintained at every family dinner, every holiday, every ordinary Sunday phone call, as though she had decided, from the very first time we met, that she would never fully let me in. Hello. My name is Miriam, and this is the story of 6 years spent believing my husband's mother simply didn't like me, and the January afternoon I finally understood that her distance had never once been about dislike at all. It had been about grief and loyalty and a secret so heavy that the only way she knew how to carry it was by keeping herself carefully separate from the person it would eventually devastate. This isn't a story about a difficult mother-in-law, though for 6 years I was certain that's exactly what this was. This is a story about a diagnosis made 3 weeks before my own wedding, a father-in-law I never got to meet, and the particular kind of love that sometimes looks, from the outside, exactly like rejection. I think you should understand, before I describe the coldness itself, how Daniel and I met, because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage built on anything less than genuine, well-founded love. We met at 27, introduced through mutual friends at a dinner party neither of us had particularly wanted to attend, and I remember being struck, that first evening, by how fully present he seemed, how he asked questions and actually listened to the answers, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. We dated for 2 years, before he proposed, on a quiet Tuesday evening on the balcony of the apartment we just moved into together. No elaborate production. Simply the two of us, and a small ring he'd clearly saved carefully for. I said yes, without a single moment of hesitation. I want you to hold that certainty in your mind, because everything that follows happened underneath it, and I need you to understand exactly how solid the ground felt beneath us before Vera's distance ever gave me reason to doubt anything at all. Our courtship, in those first 2 years, unfolded with a kind of unhurried ease I had never experienced with anyone before. Daniel took me hiking on weekends, taught me, patiently, how to cook the handful of dishes he'd learned from his mother growing up, and never once made me feel that any part of myself needed adjusting to fit more comfortably into his life. I remember in particular a weekend trip we took to the coast in our first year together, both of us sitting on a cold beach at sunset, and Daniel telling me, almost offhandedly, that he didn't believe in wasting time on relationships that weren't going somewhere real. I took that as the ordinary romantic confidence of a man falling in love, never once suspecting that it might also be the quiet urgency of someone who had, by then, already begun noticing small changes in his own body that he wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. I met Vera for the first time about 4 months into dating Daniel, at a small family dinner at her house, the same house Daniel had grown up in after his father's death, when Daniel was only 14. I remember being nervous walking in that evening, the ordinary nervousness anyone feels meeting a partner's parent for the first time, and I remember, too, the specific chill I felt when Vera greeted me, polite, but reserved in a way that struck me, even then, as different from the warmth Daniel had led me to expect. She shook my hand rather than embracing me the way I'd embraced my own future mother-in-law would, in my imagination. And she asked me a handful of perfectly ordinary questions about my work and my family, questions that felt more like a formal interview than the beginning of a relationship. I told myself, that first evening, that first impressions can be misleading, that perhaps Vera was simply a reserved woman by nature, someone who took longer than most to warm up to new people. I held on to that explanation for longer than I probably should have, because the alternative, that she simply didn't like me and never would, felt too painful to accept so early in a relationship I already knew, with total certainty, that I wanted to build a life around. But the months passed, and then the years, and Vera's reserve never once softened into anything resembling the warmth I watched her offer so easily to her sister, to her longtime neighbors, to nearly everyone else in her life except me. She attended our wedding 3 years after that first dinner, dressed elegantly and behaving with perfect, careful courtesy throughout the entire day, and yet I remember standing beside Daniel during our first dance, glancing toward the head table and watching Vera's expression as she looked at the two of us. I expected to see joy, or at least the ordinary contentment of a mother watching her son marry someone he clearly loved. What I saw instead was something closer to grief, an expression so out of place at a wedding that I nearly asked Daniel about it that very evening, before deciding, in the exhaustion and happiness of my own wedding day, that I must have simply misread her face across a crowded room. I remember, too, a smaller moment from our engagement party, nearly a year before the wedding, that I filed away at the time without giving it much weight. Vera had pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation partway through the evening, and I remember watching the two of them from across the room, her expression tight and urgent, his defensive in a way I had rarely seen him look toward his own mother. When he returned to my side a few minutes later, I asked what the conversation had been about, and he told me only that his mother worried, sometimes, that we were moving too quickly. I accepted that explanation easily, because it seemed, on its surface, like the ordinary concern any mother might voice about her son's engagement, never once suspecting that the urgency in her expression that evening had nothing to do with timing at all, and everything to do with a diagnosis that had, by then, already quietly begun taking shape in the background of both their lives. I want to be honest about how the following 6 years unfolded, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has quietly endured a similar cold distance from someone they desperately wanted to be embraced by. Every visit to Vera's house followed the same careful choreography. She would greet me politely, ask after my work and my family, serve a meal she'd clearly put real effort into preparing, and yet somehow never once crossed the invisible line between hospitality and actual warmth. She remembered my birthday every year, sending a card with a perfectly appropriate, perfectly impersonal message inside. She attended every holiday gathering, every family celebration, and yet I could never once recall a single moment of the two of us laughing together, the way I laughed easily with my own mother, with my sisters-in-law from Daniel's side of the family, with nearly everyone else in our combined social circle. In other words, what began as a single evening's awkward first impression became, over 6 years, a fixture of my marriage. I had simply learned to navigate around, the same way you learn to navigate around a piece of furniture that's always been in the wrong place, but has grown too familiar to seriously consider moving. I remember, in year 3 of our marriage, finally asking Daniel directly whether his mother disliked me. I remember his face, in that conversation, doing something I couldn't quite interpret at the time, a flicker of something that looked almost like panic, before he composed himself and told me, gently, that his mother had simply never been an easy or openly affectionate woman. Not even with him, not even in the years before his father died. He told me this with such practiced ease that I believed him completely, filing the explanation away as one more piece of information about a family history I still felt, even 3 years into marriage, that I only partially understood. I want to tell you about Daniel's father, because I think his absence from this story matters as much as his mother's coldness within it. Daniel's father, Peter, had died when Daniel was 14, of what Daniel always described, in the same careful, practiced way he described his mother's reserve, as a sudden illness that took him quickly. I never pressed for more detail than that in the early years of our relationship, because grief of that magnitude felt like territory I had no right to excavate uninvited. I understood only the barest outline. Peter had gotten sick, had declined faster than anyone expected, and had died before Daniel was even old enough to fully process what losing a father actually meant. I assumed, the way you assume things about the people you love before you've earned the full story, that this early loss explained some of Vera's guardedness, a mother who had learned, too young and too suddenly, how quickly the people you love can be taken from you, and who had perhaps never fully recovered her capacity for easy warmth afterward. I want to tell you about a particular Christmas, in year 2 of our marriage, that I still think about often, because it captures the strange, aching texture of those years better than almost any other memory I could offer you. Vera had gone to considerable effort that year, decorating her entire house in the specific, careful style I'd come to recognize as hers, and she had even, uncharacteristically, purchased a gift for me that showed real thought, a beautifully bound journal in exactly the shade of green I'd once mentioned, in passing, that I loved. I remember feeling a small, hopeful lift in my chest, opening that gift, certain it signaled some long-awaited thaw. But when I thanked her, embracing her instinctively, I felt her body stiffen slightly in my arms, the way you stiffen around an embrace you can't quite bring yourself to fully return, and the small hopeful lift I'd felt collapsed just as quickly as it had risen. I spent the drive home that evening quietly crying, unable to explain to Daniel exactly why a lovely gift had left me feeling more rejected than any outright unkindness ever could have. I did not know, for 6 years, how close that assumption came to a truth I couldn't yet see the full shape of. There is a particular incident, about 4 years into our marriage, that I still think about often. Daniel and I had been trying, without success, to start a family, and after 18 months of disappointment, I finally worked up the courage to ask Vera gently whether there was any history of fertility difficulty on Daniel's side of the family that might explain our own struggles. I watched something pass over her face that I had never seen before in all our years of careful, distant courtesy, a flash of something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. She told me, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it, that she didn't know anything useful about that, and she changed the subject so abruptly that I understood, even then, that I had touched something far more sensitive than an ordinary conversation about fertility history. I remember calling my own sister that same week, unable to hold the confusion alone any longer, describing Vera's strange, frightened reaction to my innocent question about fertility history. My sister, ever practical, suggested that perhaps there was simply an old family scandal Vera didn't want unearthed, an illegitimate cousin or a long-buried divorce, the ordinary kind of secret every family carries somewhere in its history. I remember accepting that explanation gratefully, because it was so much easier to sit with than the alternative I couldn't yet imagine, and I let the incident fade into the general, accumulating fog of 6 years' worth of small, unexplained moments I had learned to simply absorb, rather than interrogate. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever misread a person's fear as coldness, because I think it's one of the most common and most painful misunderstandings that can happen inside a family. Fear and distance can look remarkably similar from the outside, especially when the person carrying the fear has decided, for reasons of their own, that they cannot explain its source. I spent 6 years interpreting Vera's careful reserve as personal rejection, when in fact, as I would eventually learn, it was the visible edge of a much larger fear she had been carrying silently since long before I ever entered her family at all. The turning point in this story began, unexpectedly, with a stack of unopened medical mail. Daniel had been working longer hours than usual for several months, a stretch of what I assumed was simply an unusually demanding project at his firm, and one afternoon, tidying his home office while looking for a spare charging cable, I found, tucked into the back of a desk drawer beneath a stack of old tax documents, an envelope from a genetics laboratory I didn't recognize, addressed to Daniel, postmarked nearly 2 years earlier and, as far as I could tell, never opened in front of me, though the envelope itself had clearly been slit open and resealed with tape. I want to be honest about the particular quality of dread that settled over me holding that envelope. A genetics laboratory. 2 years old. Never once mentioned to me in all that time. I sat at his desk for a long while, turning the envelope over in my hands, before finally, carefully, sliding the folded papers out to read them. The letter inside was a genetic test result, dated nearly 6 years earlier, not 2. A detail that struck me as strange until I understood, much later, that Daniel had requested a second copy from the laboratory more recently, perhaps to review something he needed to reconsider. The results confirmed that Daniel carried the genetic marker for a hereditary, progressive neurological condition, one that typically began presenting symptoms in a person's late 30s or early 40s, and one that had, according to the family history section of the report, already claimed his own father's life at the age of 45. I sat at that desk for what felt like an hour, rereading the same paragraph over and over, trying to reconcile the clinical language on the page with the man I had built an entire life alongside for 8 years, married for 5 of them. The date on the original test, I noticed, was 3 weeks before our wedding. I confronted Daniel that evening, the letter trembling in my hands, my voice barely holding steady enough to form the question I needed to ask. I asked him how long he had known, why he had never told me, whether he had known, standing beside me at the altar, that he was carrying something this significant, this permanent, and had chosen, deliberately, to marry me without a single word of warning. He described, in painful detail, the exact afternoon Vera had first noticed the tremor in his hand. A small, involuntary shake she'd caught sight of while he was pouring coffee at her kitchen table, 3 months before our wedding. He said she had gone very still, watching it, and had asked him, her voice carefully controlled, whether he'd noticed it himself. He hadn't, not consciously, though once she pointed it out, he told me, he realized it had likely been present for weeks already, easy enough to dismiss as simple fatigue or too much caffeine. Vera had insisted, that same week, that he see a specialist, unwilling to explain her urgency beyond saying only that she recognized something in that tremor she desperately hoped she was wrong about. He sat down heavily at our kitchen table, his face pale in a way I had never once seen in 8 years together, and he told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had received the results 3 weeks before our wedding, after a routine test, prompted by early subtle symptoms in his own coordination that his doctor had wanted to rule out as anything serious. He told me he had sat with those results alone for 4 days, unable to find the words to tell me, and that on the 5th day, standing in front of the mirror rehearsing a conversation he couldn't bring himself to have, he had made a decision that would define the following 6 years of our marriage. He decided he would not cancel our wedding. He decided, instead, that he would tell me eventually, once he found the right moment, once he understood the diagnosis well enough himself to explain it properly, once he felt strong enough to survive the possibility that I might leave once I knew the truth. That right moment, he told me, his voice breaking completely, had never actually arrived, because every time he came close to finding it, his own fear of losing me overwhelmed whatever courage he'd managed to gather. I asked him, through my own tears, what this meant for our future, for the family we had spent 18 months quietly hoping to build, and he told me, gently, that the condition carried a 50% chance of being passed to any child of ours, information that had, in fact, been part of the reason our own fertility struggles had felt so complicated to discuss honestly, because every conversation about children had been shadowed for him by a fear he'd never once let me see clearly. I asked him, finally, the question that connected everything I had misunderstood for 6 years. I asked him whether his mother knew. He told me yes. Vera had, in fact, been the one to insist he get tested in the first place, after noticing, during a visit nearly 7 years earlier, a subtle tremor in his hand and a slight unsteadiness in his gait that reminded her, with a specific and terrible familiarity, of the earliest symptoms she had watched consume Peter 3 decades before. She had begged Daniel to get tested immediately, and when the results came back positive, 3 weeks before our wedding, she had begged him again, this time to tell me the truth before I married him, believing, with everything she had already survived once before, that I deserved the full picture before making a lifelong commitment I couldn't fully understand the terms of. Daniel told me that he and his mother had argued more bitterly in those 3 weeks than at any other point in their entire relationship. Vera had pleaded with him, reminding him of her own experience, of what it had cost her to watch Peter's decline without ever having had the chance to prepare for it properly, since Peter's own diagnosis had come only months before his death, too late for either of them to make any informed choices about the family they might have built differently. She told Daniel that keeping this from me wasn't protecting me. It was simply delaying a devastation that would arrive eventually regardless, and denying me the chance to choose, with full information, whether this was a life I wanted to build. Daniel had refused. He told me, that evening at our kitchen table, that he had been so afraid of losing me, so certain that the truth would end everything before it had even properly begun, that he had convinced himself, in the desperate logic of a frightened 29-year-old man deeply in love, that marrying me first and explaining later would somehow soften a blow that could not, in fact, be softened by timing at all. Vera, unable to change his mind and unwilling to betray her son's confidence by telling me herself, had made a decision of her own in those final weeks before our wedding. She decided that she could not, in good conscience, offer me the easy, unguarded warmth she might otherwise have felt for a young woman marrying into her family, because doing so would mean participating, emotionally if not literally, in a deception she desperately wished her son would abandon. Every warm gesture toward me, she had told Daniel once, years later, in a rare unguarded moment he only shared with me that evening, would have felt like helping build a happiness she knew, from painful experience, was standing on ground far less solid than I understood it to be. I want to tell you what this meant, once I finally understood it, because I think it recontextualizes 6 years of my life in a way I'm still, even now, working through completely. Vera's coldness had never been about me at all. Not in the way I had spent 6 years assuming. It had been the visible outline of an impossible position. A mother who loved her son enough to respect his terrible choice, and who loved me enough, sight almost entirely unmet, that she could not bring herself to perform an ease she did not actually feel about the foundation our marriage had been built upon. I spent much of those 3 days replaying old memories through this entirely new lens, understanding retroactively dozens of small moments that had once seemed like simple coldness. The way Vera always left family gatherings a little earlier than everyone else, as though she couldn't quite bear to stay in a room where Daniel and I looked so easily happy together. The way she never once asked, in 6 years, how our fertility struggles were progressing, a question that would have felt natural for almost any other mother-in-law to ask, but which I now understood she had been too afraid to raise, knowing far more than I did about why our path to parenthood might be more complicated than ordinary bad luck. The way she had, on more than one occasion, looked at Daniel with an expression I had misread as simple disapproval, when in fact I now understood it had been a mother watching her son make the same instinctive, protective mistake his own grief had once taught him, over and over, without either of them ever fully breaking the pattern. I want to tell you about the conversation I finally had with Vera 3 days after Daniel's confession, because I think the ending of this story matters every bit as much as the 6 years of silence and misunderstanding that came before it. I drove to her house alone, without telling Daniel where I was going, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she seemed to understand immediately what had finally happened. She did not ask how I'd found out. She simply stepped back to let me inside, and we sat at her kitchen table, the same table, I imagined, where she and Daniel had argued so bitterly 6 years earlier. And she told me finally her own version of everything Daniel had already begun explaining. She told me about meeting Peter when she was only 22 at a university dance neither of them had planned to attend, and about the 22 years of marriage that followed. Full of an ordinary happiness, she said she still found herself missing in small, unexpected moments, the particular way he used to hum while doing dishes, the specific brand of terrible jokes he told at every family gathering regardless of how many groans they earned him. She told me about the year everything changed, when Peter, then 44, began dropping things without noticing, developing a slight but persistent unsteadiness in his walk that they both initially attributed to simple middle-aged clumsiness. By the time doctors finally identified the cause, she said, the disease had already progressed further than anyone had realized, robbing them of the months or years they might otherwise have had to plan, to say the things people say when they know time is limited, to simply hold each other with the particular tenderness of people who understand exactly what they stand to lose. She told me about Peter, in far more detail than Daniel had ever offered me, about the speed of his decline once symptoms finally appeared, about the specific, unbearable helplessness of watching a diagnosis arrive only months before it became irreversible, too late for either of them to have made any different choices about the family they had already built by then. She told me she had spent every year since Peter's death terrified of the day she might see the same tremor, the same unsteady gait, begin in her own son, and that the day it finally happened, watching him from across her own dinner table, had been one of the worst moments of her entire life, a grief arriving years before it was technically due. She told me about the 14-year-old Daniel had been in the months following Peter's death, withdrawn and angry in ways that frightened her, unable to fully articulate a grief so much larger than anything a boy that age should have had to carry. She said she had watched him build, over the following years, a careful, guarded version of himself, one that rarely let his fear show, and she had recognized, with a mother's particular clarity, that same guarded quality reasserting itself the moment his own diagnosis arrived. She told me she understood, on some level, exactly why he had made the choice he made about our wedding, even as she considered it a mistake she could not bring herself to forgive quickly. She said watching her son repeat, in his own way, the same instinct to protect the people he loved, through silence rather than honesty, had felt like watching an old wound reopen in a shape she hadn't expected. She told me she had wanted, more than almost anything, to simply embrace me from the very first evening we met, to welcome me into her family the way she had always imagined welcoming a daughter-in-law. But every time she reached for that warmth, she said, she found herself stopped by the specific, aching knowledge of what I didn't yet know, and by her own fierce, if misguided sense, that showing me easy affection while carrying that secret would have made her complicit in something she desperately wished her son had the courage to undo. She said, and I have thought about this sentence every day since, I was so afraid that loving you fully, before you knew the truth, would feel like I was helping trick you into a life you hadn't actually agreed to. I thought the only honest thing I could offer you, since I couldn't offer you the truth itself, was distance instead of a warmth I didn't feel entitled to give. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation because I believe the ending matters every bit as much as the 6 years of cold distance that came before it. I want to tell you about the week immediately following Daniel's confession, before I ever drove to Vera's house, because I think it matters that I'm honest about how difficult that week actually was. I moved into our guest room for 4 nights, unable to lie beside him with the same unguarded trust I'd carried for 8 years. And I remember calling my own mother in tears more than once, trying to explain a betrayal that felt, in those raw first days, indistinguishable from any other kind of dishonesty a husband might be guilty of. My mother, wisely, did not tell me what to do. She simply listened and asked gently whether the man who had made this frightened, terrible choice 6 years earlier was the same steady, devoted man who had shown up for me in every other way across nearly a decade together. I sat with that question for several days before I had an honest answer. I did not leave Daniel, though I want to be honest that in the days immediately following his confession, the possibility crossed my mind more seriously than at any other point in our marriage. What kept me, in the end, was not simply love, though that mattered enormously, but a slow, careful understanding of the specific terror that had driven his silence, a terror I recognized, uncomfortably, as one I might have succumbed to myself in his position. I did not excuse the 6 years of silence. I want to be clear about that. But I came to understand it as the desperate choice of a frightened young man, rather than the calculated deception of a dishonest one. And those two things, I have learned, deserve very different responses. I asked Vera, before I left that afternoon, why she had never simply told me herself, at any point over 6 years, regardless of what it might have cost her relationship with Daniel. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me that she had, in fact, come close twice. Once during my own bridal shower, watching me open gifts with an ease and hope she found almost unbearable to witness, she had followed me into the kitchen, intending to say something, anything, and had lost her nerve the moment I turned to smile at her. The second time, she said, was the year I first mentioned wanting to start a family, and she had sat with the phone in her hand for nearly 20 minutes one evening, my number already dialed, before hanging up, terrified that breaking her son's confidence, however justified it might have felt, would cost her a relationship with him she wasn't willing to risk, even to spare me 6 more years of confusion. I embraced Vera that afternoon in her kitchen, both of us crying in a way 6 years of careful distance had never once allowed, and I told her that I understood, finally, exactly what her reserve had actually been protecting, and that I forgave her completely for the years of misunderstanding it had cost us both. She told me through her own tears that she had prayed every single year of our marriage for the day Daniel would finally find the courage to tell me himself, so that she could finally, without any complicated guilt standing between us, simply be the mother-in-law she had wanted to be from the very beginning. She showed me, before I left that afternoon, a small photo album I had never seen before, tucked away in a cabinet in her living room, full of pictures of Peter throughout their marriage, and, near the back, several pictures of Daniel as a young boy, sitting on his father's shoulders at a county fair, grinning gap-toothed in a way that reminded me instantly of the same grin our own future children might someday share. She told me she had wanted, more than once over the years, to show me that album, to let me see the fuller shape of the family I had married into, but that doing so, she said, had always felt like offering me a piece of a story she wasn't yet free to tell completely. Looking through those photographs together, finally, felt like being handed a key to a room I had circled outside of for 6 long years, never once understanding how close I had actually been to the whole truth the entire time. I want to tell you about the conversation I finally had with Daniel that same evening, once I returned home from Vera's house. I told him everything his mother had shared with me: the bridal shower, The dialed and abandoned phone call. The 22 years of marriage to a man whose decline had come too fast for either of them to properly prepare for. I watched him absorb each detail with a kind of quiet devastation I hadn't fully seen from him, even during his own confession 3 days earlier, as though hearing his mother's version of those 6 years, secondhand, made the cost of his silence real to him, in a way his own account of it hadn't managed to. He told me he intended to call her the following morning, not to apologize again for the diagnosis itself, which neither of them could control, but to finally thank her for carrying a burden on my behalf that had never been hers to carry alone. I think about those 6 years often now, the countless family dinners spent quietly aching for a warmth I couldn't understand why I wasn't receiving. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of an inexplicably cold relative, not every distance is evidence of dislike. Sometimes it is evidence of a person carrying a truth they do not have the right to reveal, choosing silence not out of coldness, but out of a painful, misguided loyalty to someone else's timeline. That does not mean my own hurt, across those 6 years, was foolish or unearned. I want to be honest about that too. A mother-in-law who never once laughs with you, who greets you with careful courtesy instead of genuine warmth, year after year, is not a small thing to endure. And a woman who feels that absence and grows quietly wounded by it is not a woman failing at generosity. She is a woman noticing a real gap in her life, and she deserves, eventually, an honest explanation for it. I think, sometimes, about the version of this story I might be telling you if I had never found that envelope in the back of his desk drawer. If the truth had simply continued to hide itself indefinitely behind 6 more years, or 10, or 20, of careful, well-intentioned silence from two people who both believed, in their own separate ways, that protecting me meant keeping me in the dark. I think about how much longer Vera might have carried her own grief alone, unable to fully embrace a daughter-in-law she wanted, more than almost anything, to love without reservation. I am grateful, in the end, not for the 6 years of confusion themselves, but for the particular, ordinary accident of an unopened envelope that finally forced a truth into the light that never should have needed forcing at all. If I could go back, I would tell Daniel, in those first weeks after our wedding, that whatever fear he was carrying deserved to be spoken aloud immediately, rather than nursed in silence for 6 years. I would tell him that love strong enough to survive a lifelong diagnosis is also, almost always, strong enough to survive the honest conversation required to reveal it, and that the 6 years he spent protecting me from a truth he assumed I couldn't handle cost us both something neither of us can fully get back. But I would also tell myself this, and I offer it now to anyone listening who is standing tonight in the particular loneliness of a relationship that has never quite warmed the way you hoped it would. Know your worth and understand that you are allowed to ask directly why a relationship feels colder than it should, rather than simply absorbing that coldness as evidence of your own inadequacy. Sometimes the answer has nothing to do with you at all. Understand that grief and fear can disguise themselves as distance far more convincingly than either one ever disguises itself as anger. A person carrying an old, unspoken sorrow will often protect themselves, and you, by withdrawing rather than by explaining, precisely because withdrawal requires no words they haven't yet found the courage to say. Remember that loyalty to one person's secret can sometimes come at a real cost to another person's peace, and that even the most well-intentioned silence deserves to be questioned eventually, gently, before it calcifies into years of unnecessary misunderstanding. Consider, too, how easily an entire family can find itself organized around a single unspoken fear, each person quietly protecting a different piece of it, none of them fully aware of how much collective pain that silence is producing until someone, by accident or by courage, finally lifts it into the light. Daniel was protecting himself from losing me. Vera was protecting her own integrity from what felt like complicity in a lie. Neither of them was protecting me from anything at all, not really. I was simply the person left standing in the space their separate fears had carved out around a truth that belonged, in the end, to all three of us together. Give yourself permission, too, to hold two seemingly contradictory truths at once, the way I have had to learn to hold them. Daniel's silence caused me real, lasting harm, 6 years of confusion and quiet grief I did not deserve and would not have chosen for myself, and Daniel's love for me, underneath that harmful silence, was never once in question. Both things are true, and learning to hold them together, rather than letting one erase the other, has been the hardest and most necessary work of the months since his confession. Learn, too, that a truth withheld out of fear of losing someone almost always ends up costing more than the truth itself would have. Daniel's silence did not protect our marriage from the diagnosis. It only delayed the moment we finally had the chance to face it honestly, together, the way partners are supposed to. And believe, finally, that the coldness you've spent years quietly absorbing is rarely the simple rejection it appears to be from the outside. Far more often, if you find the courage to ask, what you'll discover is a person carrying a grief or a loyalty so heavy that distance was the only language they had left to protect both you and themselves. Vera and I speak on the phone every week now, real conversations, full of the easy laughter I once believed we would never share. Daniel and I have chosen, together, to move forward with genetic counseling and careful family planning, and we have decided, with a clarity that only became possible once the truth was finally spoken aloud, to build whatever future is available to us with our eyes fully open, rather than shadowed by a secret neither of us should ever have had to carry alone. I want to tell you about the genetic counseling appointment we finally attended together, 3 weeks after Daniel's confession, because I think it matters as a counterpoint to the 6 years of silence that preceded it. We sat in a small, quiet office with a counselor who walked us through the specifics of Daniel's condition with a clarity and compassion neither of us had ever had access to before, explaining the range of possible timelines, the current state of research into delaying onset, and the options available to us should we choose to pursue having children through methods that could screen for the genetic marker before conception. I remember holding Daniel's hand throughout that entire appointment, feeling, for the first time in 6 years, that we were finally facing our actual circumstances together, rather than one of us facing them alone, while the other quietly absorbed the confusing fallout. Vera came with us to the second appointment, at Daniel's invitation, and I watched her ask the counselor detailed, careful questions about Peter's case, questions I understood. For the first time, she had likely never had the chance to ask anyone in the immediate aftermath of losing him, when the disease was still poorly understood and support for families like ours was far harder to find. I watched something ease in her. Over the course of that appointment, a decades-old tension finally given somewhere useful to go. Vera came to dinner last Sunday, and for the first time in 6 years, I watched her laugh, freely and completely, at something our own small dog did chasing its tail across the living room floor, and I understood, watching her, exactly how much warmth she had been holding back all along, waiting only for the day the truth would finally set both of us free to feel it. She stayed late that evening, long after Daniel had gone to bed, and the two of us sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once served me polite, careful meals for 6 years, without ever once letting the conversation drift somewhere real. She told me that night about small details of Peter's life she had never shared with anyone, not even Daniel. Memories she said she had been too afraid to revisit fully until now, when the fear that had once made those memories unbearable had finally been given somewhere honest to rest. I understood, listening to her, that I had gained something that evening far larger than simply a warmer relationship with my mother-in-law. I had gained access to an entire history, a whole unclaimed inheritance of love and grief that had been waiting patiently, for 6 years, for someone to finally be ready to receive it. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.